listening to the INL Podast with Graham Bradshaw and Philip Watkins, brought to you by Integrated Nutraceuticals Limited, Hong Kong. We're grateful to have you with us. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hi there, Philip Watkins, naturopath and Director of Education here at INL. I'd like to welcome you to the final episode of our three-part INL Christmas special. Thanks for joining us. I hope you're enjoying the series so far. As part of our special Christmas offering, we have 3 fresh episodes of the podcast recorded exclusively for our listeners with the keynote speakers at the Clinical Applications of Scientific Innovations in Functional and Lifestyle Medicine Conference, or CASI Conference, in Nashville, Tennessee. I'd like to thank our friends once again at Designs for Health for helping to facilitate this great opportunity. And whilst I had a few microphone issues on the day, I hope that the sound quality doesn't deter you from the amazing speakers included in this series and their both innovative and clinically relevant wisdom. Episode 3 sees me interview Dr. Alex Capano. Dr. Capano earned her doctoral degree at Thomas Jefferson University. She was the first doctoral candidate of any discipline who focused on cannabinoid science under the guidance of the Lambert Center for the Study of Medicinal Cannabis and Hemp at Thomas Jefferson University. Dr. Capano is a faculty member of the Lambert Center and a senior fellow in the Institute of Emerging Health Professions. She is currently conducting research on the effects of CBD oil on opioid use in chronic pain patients with a clinical focus on primary case and sexual and reproductive medicine. Dr. Capano is very much a pioneer in her field, and we spend the next 45 minutes discussing all things CBD oil, and she definitely educates me on some of the myths out there and some of the gaps between what we're hearing in the marketing and what we're really seeing in the science. Some of the science in itself is both fascinating and really, really exciting, but I think the key theme from this was just keeping in mind that science is catching up with us when it comes to CBD oil. I hope you enjoy this final part of the INL Christmas special. Another episode of the INL podcast CASI edition. Here we are in Nashville. I have yet another esteemed speaker on the CASI lineup, Alex Capano from Ananda Hemp. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, I must say, as a confession, I'm probably the most excited about your talk because I'm one of the people who is so swept up in the CBD, phytocannabinoids, the whole tidal wave that is the full spectrum, broad spectrum of it all. And I'm hoping today that you can help me understand it a little bit better.
I hope I meet those expectations.
I know, I'm sorry. I've really set it up, haven't I? I've used some amazing superlatives. But look, before we start, if in order to get a sense of where you're coming from, can you give us a bit of a sense of your role with potentially Ananda Hemp and how you've ended up, coming and talking to us about CBD?
Sure. So my educational background is pretty varied that led me here. Originally, I have a degree in neuroscience, then went back to school and became a family NP. I practiced in primary care and sexual medicine full-time for several years. Then I went back to school and got a doctoral degree focused on cannabinoid science.
Wow.
That wasn't really an option for anyone before me. I was really in the right place at the right time. I happened to ask to the right person who gave me the opportunity. So even though, I have other disciplines under my belt, and that's what I started going back to school for yet again, the 4th time, people often say that I'm the first person with a doctoral degree, at least in the U.S., on cannabinoid science, because no one had the opportunity before. So when I finished that, I met the chairman and CEO of EcoFiber, who are actually from Australia. And that is a company that's been around for over 20 years, doing some really interesting research on hemp, but cannabis in general. And they brought me on as their chief science officer. And EcoFiber is the company that owns Ananda here in the U.S. So I do research, product development, education, and really wear a lot of different hats for them.
Wow, and that's amazing. The fact that you've gone through so many different ways of studying as well is fascinating. Talk to me about the beginning of the phytocannabinoid research, I guess, essentially, because one of my pet kind of hobbies, so to speak, is following a group called MAPS. the
Yes.
Multidisciplinary Association for
That's
Psychedelic
very
Study.
cool.
And, I think I had the pleasure of meeting Rick Doblin in 2014, and one of the interesting things that he always touched on was that we knew that, marijuana essentially had, or I should more refer it to as cannabis. Is there a particular way I should refer it to cannabis, I guess?
Yeah,
That's-
you should refer to it as cannabis, but cannabis comes in two different forms,
Sure, so it's still species specific, right?
but the species is cannabis,
Yeah. So the notion that cannabis has these medicinal properties, we knew about it. There were a lot of people who were self-medicating even then, and there were very strict restrictions in relation to the research of it. How has it unfolded now? Was there a particular turning point in the research where we were able to maybe open the door a little bit more? Can you talk a little bit about the origin of some of this, if there was one?
Certainly. So the reality is humans have been using cannabis medicinally, spiritually, recreationally maybe, for all of documented human history, really across every continent. So there's, documentation in Africa, Asia, Europe, the U.S. from, centuries, if not millennia ago. Now, in the U.S., I can really speak to that more, and then we tended to influence what happened elsewhere. But in 1937, something called the Marijuana Tax Act was passed. Before that, cannabis or marijuana was in the U.S. pharmacopoeia and actually one of the most, if not the most, prescribed medication in the U.S. And this tax act was passed really due to a lot of political reasons. It was not about safety or efficacy. And to be honest, it was steeped in some pretty ugly cultural and political baggage, having to do with Mexican immigrants at the time. The American Medical Association vigorously opposed that. And even in our congressional library, it says that this act passed in response to the opioid lobby and the competition for pain management space.
Wow, even back in the history.
Yes, back in the history. And I always like to mention that's not my personal conspiracy theory.
No, that's
in the
okay.
Library of Congress in D.C. And then later on, the Controlled Substances Act passed in 1970. That was equally, if not more, frankly, repulsive in a lot of racism, which made cannabinoids, so these molecules in a cannabis plant, Schedule I, meaning they had no medicinal benefit, even though there had been documented use and people were using them. Anyway, fast forward to the 90s. That's when Dr. Raphael Mechoulam and his team in Israel identified the endocannabinoid system. And it was called that because they had actually previously identified delta-9 THC and CBD and some other cannabinoids. And then they figured out this system in our bodies on which they work. So it's been, quite some time. I believe that was 92. But there was a lot of really interesting research that really started in Israel and is still going on in Israel. They've really been at the forefront of this. But there's been a lot of barriers to research elsewhere, especially in the U.S. We just passed something called the Farm Bill. Originally in 2014, that was a pilot program and a little tricky to interpret. In 2018, it became very clear and permanent. And that means that cannabinoids, if they're derived from hemp, which just means low THC cannabis, are no longer part of the Controlled Substances Act. So that is opening doors for research. There's definitely still barriers, but before then it was really difficult to get a grant for research or approval. You had to have a Schedule I license, and you had to get up through a particular farm in Mississippi.
I heard about this, right? It was at the University of Maryland.
Mississippi.
Yeah.
With Dr. El Soli, who's brilliant, and that's his farm. But and most of it was funded by NIDA, which is the National Institute for Drug Abuse. So it was about abuse and harm as opposed to medicinal use. So that's where the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century had us, and we were in this, just pause in history where prohibition stopped the research. But if you look at the scheme of things, it's actually kind of a blip on the radar.
And it's interesting now that the subject of the talk that you're giving this afternoon is in relation to pain management and also the opioid element of things. Can you give us a little bit more of a sense of the where we're at with pain management and phytocannabinoids and stuff like that, and maybe if you want to give us a sneak preview.
Sure.
I did warn you I was going to be self-indulgent, and of what's coming up in relation to the how we're looking at it, because I think I watched the documentary about the opioid crisis a long time ago that was done by the same director as the Cocaine Cowboys, and that actually blew my mind, and the title of it escapes me now, but that was probably around 5 years ago. Do you remember that documentary at all? They were travelling around the Florida pain clinics and all of that kind of thing. But it'll come to me in about a few hours when we're not recording. But what's the situation now, I guess, in 2019? Obviously, there are a few parts to that question, so start whichever way you want to. Yeah.
I just spoke in London at a dinner, and I was speaking about the opportunity for cannabinoids in pain management and as a tool to combat the opioid crisis. And I said, "Is it as bad here?" And there was an emphatic no. Like, you Americans have really screwed the pooch on that. So, for those of you who don't know, the opioid crisis in America is very, very real. The United States is definitely suffering from it. I know that does occur elsewhere, and hopefully it's not to that extent. But we are certainly in a crisis, and we need solutions. So over 70% of people who use heroin originally started with a prescription opioid. And these are really, really difficult medications to get off of, whether or not you have a substance use problem or you don't, because you will be physiologically dependent on them. And in the 90s, practitioners were told these are not dangerous and they're not habit forming, and obviously that was not the case, the reality. But we were misinformed. And so now we have this problem, and people are in pain. We learn pain is the fifth vital sign. We need to treat it. And if we just withdraw opioids, we may lead them to the illicit market because it's cheaper and it's easier to get, and the withdrawal is really, really terrible and is a major barrier to getting off of these medications. Number one, withdrawal. And two is people are in pain and we need to treat their pain. So we don't have great alternatives. We have maintenance therapy, which is controversial at best. But when we look at cannabinoids, there's really an opportunity there, and particularly for CBD. So CBD is going to be the cannabinoid the word is not psychoactive. I don't love that word because it's anti-anxiety.
It has very particular connotations to it as well, right?
Yeah, it's like it won't intoxicate you.
No.
THC will intoxicate you, particularly at high levels, but CBD won't. So we know that cannabinoids in general, so speaking of both CBD and THC, have pain management potential. The National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine did a meta-analysis. JAMA, so the Journal of the American Medical Association, did a systematic review. Both of those bodies, who are pretty well respected, concluded that cannabinoids were effective for pain and pretty well tolerated. We also know that they don't have the addiction risk and dependency potential of opioids, and that you cannot physiologically overdose. You're not going to have respiratory depression when you're accidentally overdosing on these. The worst thing that's going to happen is maybe you need 5 bags of Doritos.
Yeah.
And that's really only with THC.
Gastric distress.
Yeah. So we see, one, that cannabinoids are effective for treating pain. And this has really been established time and time again in the research across different pain modalities. And that's probably where we have the best research in cannabinoids and pain. So we know it's effective. And then two is it safe to use in conjunction with opioids as an adjunct? Because we worry about adding anything to an opioid regimen and increasing the risk of respiratory depression. Well, pharmacokinetic studies show that CBD does not increase the risk of respiratory depression. There's some limited evidence that THC doesn't either, but it just hasn't been studied as well.
Okay.
But most of us don't. It does not appear to.
Yeah.
So you're going to treat the pain. You're going to treat that fifth vital sign. It's safe to add to that regimen. Not going to increase respiratory depression. So it may help better manage pain, but also maybe a nice alternative as opposed to a benzo for anxiety or hypnotic for sleep that does come with that risk. And third, there's some really good evidence that's been emerging very recently about CBD's potential to decrease opioid withdrawal symptoms and to make people more successful in titrating down because they're not experiencing anxiety, nausea, palpitations, diarrhea, all of that comes with this really unpleasant experience and barrier to titration. So you're treating the pain, you can add it as an adjunct safely. Eventually, when someone's ready to titrate down, this is going to help them do it more. And lastly, there's some emerging, very promising evidence, although mostly in preclinical models, that CBD may actually help with substance use disorder.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
Whether it's opioids, cocaine, and alcohol, we're seeing that pretty remarkably in animal studies.
Wow.
So that's it. There's a huge opportunity here. The safety profile is just so much better. But there's problems. I mean, it could cause someone to fail a drug test, and a pain management clinic might be drug testing you. You can take opioids, but you can't take CBD. So there's policy and politics that are need to evolve with the research.
Do you think that that's on its way? I mean, I know that since I've come to the US and maybe done a little bit more research, that there are still states that are coming around to medical use of cannabis and things like that. Do you think that the federal acceptance of I think the Farm Act, as you mentioned, to interpret it correctly, is that CBD with low levels of THC is okay, which I think we're now looking at with Hong Kong.
Right.
Do you think that the federal acceptance of cannabis will allow us to look at more things, or is it just more that the research is still so much in its infancy that we need more studies and more rounds and to get a better sense of how to apply it, so to speak?
We certainly need more studies, but I think when it comes to the topic we're on, it's about policy, and it's just, the law is often the last to catch up. I mean, we look at technology, the law's way behind. It's the same thing with healthcare and innovative healthcare, certainly. So we need policy change, and unfortunately it moves at a glacial pace. I am seeing people at least open to discussions, so human resources executives asking me, hey, how do I allow my employees to use these products that may be helpful, but still stick to my policy and procedure that if they fail a random drug screen, they're subject to whatever consequences they have.
It's an interesting point, isn't it? Because I think essentially if you draw the lens out a little bit, using constant opioids would probably affect your work, maybe potentially more so than the use of CBD or something along those lines. And it does give us a sense of exactly how far we may need to go in relation to all of this.
And then over time, it's health costs to the individual, but also to the organization that's probably paying their health insurance, or they have to take days off. So there's a number of reasons to change that. And my husband is actually a labor and employment lawyer, and his firm's stance has evolved to be just don't test for it.
Well, that's kind of where we're going now, isn't it? It's just like, why don't we just leave it off the panel? You don't have to stop testing entirely, but
if there's a question of intoxication, acute intoxication in the workplace, there are ways to test for that.
That's right.
But as far as everything else, is the legal landscape's a little blurry because of hemp versus what we're calling marijuana in the U.S. Safety is certainly better with it. So hopefully they will influence enough clients where that becomes the norm, but we'll see.
We'll see. It'll be a great situation. I wanted to ask you about pain management and maybe the application of pain management in relation to CBD, as far as how we can potentially identify people who might benefit the most from it clinically. Are we further enough down the track to associate particular conditions with CBD yet, or are we looking at still trying to work that out? is there a possibility that we can just say, hey, if you're experiencing an inflammatory process, because look,
well, most things are, right?
I've taken enough CBD now to think that, you know, if I've had a rough day at the gym, my joints are feeling pretty good afterwards, and you know, I think I've had, you know, some experience with my patients already as well. I mean, are there any particular conditions that have come up on your radar? Is there anything you want to comment on in relation to that?
Yes. So neuropathic pain has been pretty well studied.
Really? Okay.
And looks very promising. So across different etiologies of neuropathic pain, particularly chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy is a really big interest area of ours right now, and we're going to be studying that in humans this year with some experts in the field, in the oncology field. In animals, if you use CBD in conjunction with these chemotherapy agents that have such a high incidence of causing CIPN, it eliminates it from ever forming. Right. So, you know, we have to do the work on treating it first. The FDA told us.
Of course.
Even though we have so many case studies, we have some research, but you know, we need to do this FDA-approved trial, and then we can safety study, and then we can back up and hopefully prevent it in the first place, because it seems to work better for prevention. So neuropathic pain, and if someone's ever using a topical, which is a great use, I prefer an ingestible for daily use. The topical is great as an adjunct. If it's neuropathic pain, I'd also apply it to the dermatome associated with that pain. Right. Yes. Okay. Now, there are not studies about
No, that's okay, but we're here to treat people and get people better, right?
But when I first heard it, a colleague of mine was using it that way with a lot of success. I'm admittedly quite skeptical, but have become a convert. So with neuropathic pain, certainly to the site, if you're using topical, also apply to the dermatome. So neuropathic pain would be the low-hanging fruit, maybe, in pain.
But also one that's difficult to treat. You're getting a lot of people using Lyrica and with varied results as well. And obviously the diabetes, you know, neuropathy is a huge complication.
We see a little bit of vasodilation too, so that would be nice for that population. And the National Pain Foundation did a study on fibromyalgia patients. Found that Lyrica, Savella, and the other very common prescriptions for fibromyalgia that's escaping me, you know, were effective maybe 5 to 10% of the time. But cannabinoids, it was about 68% of the time.
Okay, that's a huge differential.
It was really inverse response rates. Only 5% of these, it was 1,300 patients with fibromyalgia, said cannabinoids didn't help at all, where it was about 60+% for the prescription meds. So neuropathic pain and these really difficult to treat symptoms are definitely a good, you know, population to target. And musculoskeletal as well. I mean, anything with some sort of inflammatory etiology. Yeah.
Having a rough day at the gym.
Yeah. You're right.
I'm interested. My initial clinical years were spent treating a lot of fibromyalgia and in a psychiatric landscape. And not only did it teach me about the pain as being one of the possibly the heaviest symptoms to deal with, but one of the things that I learned during that period of time, and one of the reasons why I'm quite interested in CBD, is that there is such a connection with the brain and pain. And I'm hoping that you could educate me more in relation to the phytocannabinoid and endocannabinoid system, if that's okay, if I've even labelled it correctly.
Yes.
I'm still a newbie.
You're doing great.
Consuming as much as I possibly can, and thank you for helping me out. Could you educate us a little bit more about the system itself and how it all comes together? Because I know that echinacea as a herb also works on the endocannabinoid system as well, and there's receptors that are responsive to it. So it's not just cannabis that has a relationship to this system.
Right.
Can you give us some insights there and help me, I guess, understand a little bit better?
So the endocannabinoid system is exceedingly complex and poorly understood by most, so we'll do what we can.
Thank you.
But it's made up primarily of two different types of receptors, CB1 and CB2 receptors. And CB1 they're both G-coupled proteins, but CB1 is the most abundant G-coupled protein in the brain and also exists in the central nervous system. CB2 receptors are in the brain and central nervous system, but not as abundantly. They tend to cluster in the periphery and particularly on immune cells.
Right.
So these two receptor types interact with multiple different cell types and exist really on every organ system in our body. And they are tasked with maintaining homeostasis. So when you start to understand that this endocannabinoid system regulates mood, inflammation and immune response, sleep-wake cycle, hormonal balance, particularly fertility, the HPA axis, cardiovascular health, whether it's perfusion, vasodilation, digestion, et cetera, it starts to make sense that why interacting with or manipulating sounds so negative, but manipulating the system.
No, it's contextual.
Yes. This system, you're able to influence so many different symptoms or clinical conditions, and then it starts to feel less like snake oil. And it's also an adaptogenic system, for example. So what we see in sleep with CBD and with the way the endocannabinoid system works in sleep is there's both preclinical and human models of improvements in insomnia and especially anxiety-induced insomnia in sleep. However, in healthy individuals who are sleeping well, it doesn't alter their sleep cycles.
Right.
And the same thing with blood pressure. Sure, it will decrease an elevated blood pressure, but it's not going to make someone hypotensive. And even with patients with HIV, because this is an immunomodulator and is immunosuppressive, that's how it's anti-inflammatory, it does not, decrease the immune system or suppress the immune system to the point where it's dangerous, especially in those who are already vulnerable. So there needs to be more research on chemo, but in HIV-positive patients, we don't see that risk. So these cannabinoids, we actually make our own in our body. So we make two main cannabinoids, anandamide and 2-AG, and then we can get these phytocannabinoids from plants, typically the cannabis plant, but you're right, and not always, that kind of add more fuel to that system to help it work a little bit better, and it's all about homeostasis. Even one of the terpenes, beta-caryophyllene, which is present outside of cannabis, but is pretty abundant in the cannabis plant, is certainly considered a cannabinoid and interacts with these receptors.
Right.
It is anti-inflammatory, it influences pain, and it boosts the activity of CBD and THC. So there's...
It's it's funny. I'm after training so long and working with natural medicine, one of the things that I think I disconnect with a lot is how systematically perfect some natural agents are. And I think by describing the way that the endocannabinoid system works with CBD, bringing down blood pressure but then stopping once it's balanced, and then people who are already sleeping okay, it not really working for, it really does bring that natural balance into play, doesn't it? That you don't have to fix something that isn't broken.
Yes, and it sounded too good to be true to me at first.
It has that ring though, right? You'd be forgiven for feeling that way.
And I thought the word adaptogenic was kind of, I don't know, pseudoscience, but I've learned that I'm wrong.
No, fair play.
Very real.
Yeah.
And again, I've been converted a number of ways here, but it's good to be skeptical about this because I think the best way to shut something down is to act like it's a miracle for everyone and everything. So I always want to be objective and honest that there's a lot of potential here across a number of conditions. Most people respond really well. The safety profile is great. So not everyone's going to respond all the time, but you're really not risking much, especially at these lower doses where we're seeing therapeutic response. But yes, I do like to maintain objectivity.
Which is
because I don't
important,
want to
right?
kill it.
Yeah. But also, I think that actually leads me to one of my final questions for you is, can you bust some myths for me? Because I think I've had some pretty outlandish things asked me in the clinic of CBD, and I think talking to your point about the miracle panacea, I'm actually at the point where I'm actually somewhat entertaining it, because until I've researched it, I don't want to just say, no, you're just losing it. You can't grow rockets out of your feet and fly to the moon. I mean, it might be possible, but can you bust some of the myths that maybe we haven't quite got there yet, or are there things that we need to know just to keep that level of objectivity, perhaps?
Certainly. So I've had this question more than once.
Okay.
About alopecia but more so really just male pattern baldness. Does CBD cure that? And I'm like, no.
Okay. That's a pretty long bow, and one of my patients
there is
was
no reason to support that. But if somebody is using CBD and they're telling me that their hair is growing back,
well, this is the
but I think it's true and unrelated. And then another thing, and this is actually pretty scary and unethical in my opinion, is you see, especially on social media, things like, cannabis cures cancer.
Yeah.
And that's not the case. We do not have the evidence to say that. We don't understand it well enough at all. There's some interesting and promising studies done in vitro with human cancer cells. Whether that translates into the human body, we don't know. We don't know what this is not a substitute for proven medications that your oncologist is, and that you want to treat. I mean, bodily autonomy is very important, but, if somebody says, don't take your chemo, just take CBD, that really scares me.
Yeah.
And it's really not ethical, and there's not research to back that up. We're a long way away from that. We're starting to explore it, and I don't mean eco-fiber, I just mean the researchers that I'm part of. But, this is something that could help make that experience potentially less horrific for you. It could help you sleep better, feel less anxious, could help with pain, could help with nausea and appetite. But I do worry when people try to act that this is the panacea and you don't need anything else, because you do. Also, yes, great for pain relief, but if you, got your arm cut off in an accident, CBD's not going to cut it.
It's not going to stitch it back up.
No.
Are you sure?
Yeah. Yes.
Positive? How about if I break my leg? Can I maybe dermally heal my leg with CBD?
No.
No?
Yeah,
okay.
You cannot.
So,
I mean, I had appendicitis a couple of years ago, and that was a time where morphine was welcome.
Yes, indeed, right. And
after surgery, I used CBD instead, but acutely, there's a time and place for these stronger pain meds.
I completely agree. And I think one of the interesting things I find about CBD, and I think I've drawn from this conversation, so I appreciate it, is that one of the older, lesser used category of herbal medicine was what we call the tonic herbs. And they were there. You had different tonics, and a lot of people don't know that St. John's wort was actually what we call the nervous tonic. It never had a connotation with, an SSRI mechanism or anything along those lines. If someone came in with a lot on their mind, St. John's wort as a tonic would release the tension of the head, and it kind of put you on a bit of a cloud, maybe elevated your mood, or a thymoleptic kind of action. And I think what I've gotten out of today is that moving away from the panacea, we may have actually found a potential tonic for something where if you're feeling a little bit out of balance, we may find that CBD is something that can help you regain that balance, just as you touched on with the homeostatic element. Do you think that's a fair comment, or is it more that I'm now searching for a different way to describe a panacea and semantically looking to still keep my miracle alive?
No, I think that's accurate. cautious optimism is
Sure.
always good.
I like it. Yep.
Although 2 areas that we didn't talk about that I think will be more than it's tonic. One, we certainly know epilepsy.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, of course.
That is really a lifesaver.
It started the process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And 2, what we're seeing is that CBD, especially cannabinoids, but particularly CBD, are not just neuroprotective. They may have some neuroregenerative potential.
Right.
So the research in animals is pretty much there, but we don't have it in humans. But what I want to see is this a possible treatment for degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, MS? And we're looking at dementia patients, but is it just something that can slow mild cognitive decline with aging and potentially prevent these over time and maybe even reverse some of the damage? And we're definitely a ways away from really demonstrating that with volumetric studies and functional MRIs, but we're getting there. We've got some great colleagues and some plans to do so, and I think that is a very black and white use.
Do they have a sense of the mechanism as yet? Is it are there elements of BDNF or other areas of hypothalamic atrophy? Is there any ideas yet as where that might be coming from?
It seems to decrease degenerating neurons, the spread of that, and that even after hypoxic ischemia, so it can stop the perfusion of an injury acutely.
Right.
But also just tends to promote regeneration of neurons. There's some debate on the mechanism there, and it's a lot about oxidative potential and modulating that into the right balance. Yeah. But
still early days.
It is early days, and to be honest, there's some other researchers who are just fascinating neuroscientists and vascular specialists who would probably argue with me, no, we really know what this is, but I can't speak to it as well.
Look, I really, really appreciate you making this time. You've had a very tight schedule since you've been at Cassie, and the insights you've given us today have just been fantastic. And I think bringing a very balanced view to phytocannabinoids means that its potential remains constant. And that is in itself very exciting. And I must say, I cannot wait to see you unveil the talk later on this afternoon. If people want to know more about the work that you do, or how to maybe potentially get in touch and find out more, is there a website or somewhere that they can go to find out more?
So either ecofiber.com or anandahemp.com, and that is where I work, but that is mostly what I do. So they're the best at getting in touch with me, and we put everything up there.
Yeah, no problem. No, that's great. Well, look, once again, Alex, thank you again for bringing a very controlled but also very enlightening view on CBD and phytocannabinoids for us, because, as I said, I've learned a lot, and now I've got a lot of research to do. So I very much appreciate that. Enjoy the rest of your time here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And thank you again. Bye-bye.
The INL Podcast is brought to you by Integrated Nutraceuticals Limited, Hong Kong. If you want to know more about INL, natural medicine, or how to unlock the potential of our range, simply go to www.inl.asia and sign up for our newsletter, or simply browse through our education section to see what you can find. We'll be back soon with another episode. Thanks for joining us.